Good evening, and thank you for joining the Westerly Library in Wilcox Park for tonight's author talk. This program is being presented using the webinar version of Zoom, and attendees are joining in listening mode only. Please send any and all questions through the Q&A feature or the chat feature at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to answer them within the time we have allotted. Please note that this program is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel at a later date. Should you get disconnected, simply use the link that was emailed to you earlier to get back into the program. I will now turn it over to our moderator for tonight, a member of the board of the Friends of the Library, Mary Weiss.
Thank you very much, Amanda. Good evening and welcome to this virtual author talk with Bryn Turnbull about her recently released book, a fiction novel, historical fiction, called The Last Grand Duchess, giving the reader an inside view of the last years of the Romanovs of Russia. Bryn is joining us virtually from Toronto, Canada. The Last Duchess is Bryn's second novel, after her critically acclaimed debut novel, The Woman Before Wallace, which I really have on my list to read, I must say. It is said that Bryn focuses on stories of women lost within the cracks. I'm not sure who said that, but it's really a good quote. I like that a lot. I like that a lot. We're just delighted to have you join us this evening. I want to point out that we invited Bryn to join us with this book that was just released in early February, before the February 24th, 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine. We believe that your book now has added and timely significance by providing the historical context for this war and the relationship between Russia and the Ukraine. If I may, before we begin, I'd like to provide a brief overview of that 250-year relationship for our audience. The House of Romanov ruled Russia from 1613 to 1917. In 1613, Mikhail was named the first Romanov Czar. His grandson, Peter the Great, established the Russian Empire in 1721. Between 1772 and 1795, most of Western Ukraine was absorbed into the Russian Empire. In 1783, Ukraine declared its independence with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which was, that goes a little bit further on. I jumped ahead, I'm sorry. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk that was signed in March of 1918 provided for Russia and the end of World War II. They left Russia the war before the Allies did in November of 1918. However, in 1920, the Bolsheviks incorporated Ukraine as a Soviet republic. So here we are again, going back into that domination. Between 1921 and 1922, the Russian army conquered 2/3 of Ukraine. The western third of Ukraine became part of Poland, but subsequently was annexed by Russia in 1939. With the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Ukraine regained its independence. There have been 2 Ukrainian revolutions since then, in 2004, 2005, and 2013 and 2014, to maintain its independence from Russia. Today, Ukraine is yet again fighting with Russia to be independent. So I hope that wasn't too much compressed history in too short a period of time, but this relationship does go back a very long time. Now, I read a recent statement, which I wanted to read to you, Bryn, and see your perspective on it. Under the Romanovs, the communists and Mr. Putin, political thought has been shaped by 3 beliefs. 1, that Russia is different. 2, that the difference is transcendentally important. And that 3, it gives Russia a unique role in the world. Now, do you think that Nicholas II, the last Russian Tsar and the father of Olga, his eldest daughter and the Grand Duchess of your book, would agree with this statement? I can repeat it if you want. If so, and how, or if not, why not?
Yeah, no, I think that that's a very apt observation about Russia and the role that Russia seen itself in for so long. I mean, we have to bear in mind when Nicholas was Tsar, Russia covered 1/6 of the entire globe. The Russian Empire was that big. And we kind of, it's easy, I think, for us in the Western world to think of Russia as part of the West. And Russia really kind of, certainly at that time, it didn't see itself as Western. It certainly didn't see itself as European. And so I think, talking about that difference is very much part of the psyche, particularly during Nicholas's time. They were an empire. They did conquer, they conquered vast swaths of land, Ukraine included, as you mentioned. And so I think in differentiating themselves from the West and differentiating themselves from Europe, I think that is one of the reasons why there is this sense of, authority, let's say, that kind of has pushed through to today. And the conflict in Ukraine is such, the war in Ukraine is such a tragic and unnecessary event. This book deals with the consequences of war and totalitarianism, particularly, in Olga's perspective. She sees it not only as the daughter of a perpetrator of a totalitarian regime, but also as a victim later on in her own life. And on top of that, she nurses soldiers. She sees the consequence of war throughout her life as a Red Cross nurse. And so, I think that there are many different aspects of this story that speak to today in a way that certainly when I was writing it, I never intended for it to do. But it is, the timing is really quite interesting.
Well, it's interesting to pick up on that thread of thought about how Nicholas thought of himself as Tsar, because we think of a democratic government, we think of electing people, but he didn't view himself that way. How did he view himself as Tsar?
Certainly did not see himself as democratically elected, because that was not how an empire, was formed. It was formed in his mind through divine right to rule. And, at the turn of the century, when Nicholas was ruler, this notion of the divine right to rule had kind of fallen out of favor all across Europe. We see other dynasties get deposed. We see some modernized, such as the House of Windsor, who looked at ways of incorporating democratic processes into, the dynastic system. To Nicholas, that was all completely outside the realm of what was needed. He truly thought of himself as, it was his God-given right to rule. God had ordained him to lead Russia, and he really didn't need help from anybody else. Thank you very much. In 1905, there was a revolution, the October Revolution, which basically resulted in the formation of the State Duma. And the Duma was kind of Nicholas's attempted concession towards these democratic leanings, and these democratic kind of urgings, which were bubbling up in Russian society. But he never truly accepted or took to heart what that actually meant for him. He still thought of himself as an autocrat. Right to his dying day, he thought of himself as an autocrat.
Well, and God was speaking to him all the time. Nicholas, do this, Nicholas, do that. And how could he make a mistake if God was telling him what to do? That's the sense I have.
And that's such an interesting notion for him to have, because to Nicholas was an incredibly ineffectual ruler. We look at his tenure, and it ends with him. The Romanov 300 years of Romanov rule ends with him, and it ended with him for a very good reason, because he was not a good ruler. And part of that was this notion of, whatever I think is what God is telling me to do. People knew how to play that against him, because, it was the last person in the room to talk to him. It would change his mind. And so, he'd go from one position to another position. He'd flip-flop back and forth. Nobody really knew what position he would end up on, because it kind of all came down to, who did I speak to last? Yeah, that sounds pretty great.
Well, I think one telling example of that in your book was where he thought he could just take command of the military, and he was going to defeat the Germans. And he had absolutely no experience. He had no clue as to what he was doing. And I don't
None
think that
whatsoever.
worked out too well for him, did it?
No, it did not at all. But he, in his mind, it was, this is what God has told me to do, and if God is on my side, I can't fail. I think anybody who has these notions of destiny feels the same way, regardless of what side of the spectrum you're on. So can God be on both sides at the same time?
Well,
During
it's
the
sort of
war?
interesting, because you cover these critical years before the fall of the Romanovs. And during that period of time, do you see Nicholas maturing at all, or saying, well, gee, maybe I made some wrong turns here. Maybe I'm the cause of the problem. Did he ever change? No.
It's so interesting because I did a lot of research for this book. The Romanovs are they're the most documented family in history. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of resources and pages written on this family, including their own diaries. And Nicholas was a good father, but I wouldn't say that he was a self-reflective man. I certainly would not say he was a good ruler. And so, you get to the end of his life and he didn't see it coming. He didn't see the writing on the wall, and he certainly didn't see, I don't believe that he saw the steps that he had taken, which had led towards this critical juncture in history.
Well,
to his mind, it was, well, we're gonna get rescued. It's totally fine.
Well, the woman behind the man, Alexandra, she wasn't helping that much either to kind of bring him back to reality. And there's a famous quote where she said, Alexander is God's emissary on earth. The Czar simply needed to wave his hand and his will be done.
Mm-hmm.
Meanwhile, the country's falling apart. People are starving. They're losing the war to Germany. And she's like, well, they just wave his hand and so,
it'll all get done. But I mean, that speaks to the fundamental lack of connection that the Tsar and Tsarina had to their people. They thought of themselves as the little father and little mother of Russia, but Alexander in particular was an incredibly reclusive woman, and Nicholas was a rather reclusive emperor. They didn't go to parties. They didn't speak to people. They really, unless it was in a carriage occasionally waving to the masses, they didn't really hear what was going on in Russia. They stayed behind their palace walls. And that, I think, was their ultimate, that was the fatal flaw for them, because the only person coming in and out of the palace whose opinion they trusted, whose opinion they valued, was Grigory Rasputin. And so everything that they heard about Russia was kind of filtered through him. And as we know, he wasn't exactly a good guy himself.
We'll get to him in a minute, because he is a unique character. So I think it sort of summed up in your book, where you said Alexandra, that's the wife, said that autocracy is what's best for Russia. Mm-hmm. Alexandra said that Nicholas just doesn't understand that to be feared, to be hated, so long as you're acting in accordance with God's will. Mm-hmm. I don't think God ever said that the way to go is to have people hate you. I mean, that seems a little contradictory, but is there a way to kind of tie this in, and maybe I'm way off the mark here, to what Mr. Putin's thinking and what he can do and going into Ukraine this way? And
well, I mean, I think that the impulse to autocracy has long been in Russia, right? I mean, there's always been kind of the strongman figure, and right now it's certainly Putin. And yeah, I think that, with Nicholas and Alexandra, theirs was a very paternalistic view of their people. It was, we know what's best, and we're going to do it regardless of whether they want it or not, because in the long run, we're right. And put aside the fact that we don't actually have a grasp on the issues at hand, or put aside that this is not what the people want. We're going to do it because we are the leaders, and that's kind of what we're going to do. And you see Putin kind of going down the same route with, well, this is what's going to happen regardless of whether people are want it or not. You kind of get the sense that there's that same autocratic paternalism, let's say, in how he's approaching Ukraine.
Well, now we're going to switch a little bit and talk about your book, which is actually the main topic for this evening's conversation. When I browse in a bookstore or surf the internet for a new book, a book's title and cover naturally attract me to the book. Your book title and subtitle succinctly tell the reader what the book is about. The Last Grand Duchess, a novel of Olga Romanov, Imperial Russia, and the Revolution. However, it's the striking image of a woman's profile holding a string of pearls that most drew my attention. Is it significant we see the woman's profile from the waist up, but not her full face? Does this tell us something about her? I'm hoping our audience can see this a little bit.
I have to tell you, I love this cover so much. And yeah, I mean, I think having that sense of mystery about the top half of her face, we know Olga's visage, right? Hers is one of those very well-known faces in history. But kind of giving her that ambiguity, I think, was really important. One of the things that I really wanted to do with this book is I wanted to pull her out from behind the title, and I wanted to look at her not, she is a Grand Duchess, and that's how everybody knows her. But what was so important to me was looking at her as a human being and as an individual, as a daughter, as a young woman, not as part of the dynasty necessarily. So that was really kind of my task that I set for myself in writing this book. Olga and her sisters, in the history book, we hear about Nicholas and Alexander, we hear about Alexei and Rasputin, and the four daughters are kind of lumped to the side. And then there was Otma, OTMA, which was the amalgamation of their first names, or first initials. We hear about Anastasia, but we hear about her in the context of pretenders, not Anastasia herself. And that never really sat right with me, that here are these four young women, and they weren't children, they were young women. These four young women whose stories are kind of always swept off to the side in favor of looking at them through the context of Nicholas and Alexandra or Alexei and Rasputin. And so I so wanted to look at Olga individually, pull her out from Otma and just look at Olga specifically herself.
Well, you definitely have done that.
Thank you.
Going back to this picture again.
Yes.
And maybe I'm reading too much into this, but it's been fun trying to do that. She seems very poised, but her hands are sort of clutching these pearls. Maybe she's a little tense, maybe she's holding them lovingly. I'm not really sure. But were you trying to send a message with these pearls and how she's grasping them?
Absolutely. You'll notice in the book, the imagery of the pearls comes back a couple of times. But there are a few scenes where these pearls come into play, most notably at the very end of the book. And that sense of how she's holding them, I love the ambiguity that is in that image. We don't know whether it's tense, we don't know whether it's lovingly. And I certainly have my view on what she's thinking as she's holding these pearls. The whole book is a tense book, though, right? It starts with tension. It starts with, it starts with the night of her father's abdication, and it moves on from there. And so I love the fact that you don't really know what she's thinking as she holds.
I think in the book, and of course this is a narrative that you've imagined, but based upon all your research, her father tells her when he gives her the pearls, this is to mark your entrance into womanhood. I'm like, okay, pearls, they're nice. It's jewelry, that's nice, but why entrance into womanhood? What was so significant about pearls doing that? Is there anything significant?
Well, it's not so much the pearls that were significant. He gave them to her on the night of her coming out ball. So she had this coming out ball at Anichkov Palace, she and her sister. It had been delayed for a year because her mother didn't want to go through the rigmarole of having two coming out balls. So she was like, well, wait till Tatiana's old enough, and then we're going to give you both a coming out ball together, which is so typically Alex. So the pearls were kind of ancillary to this moment where they're having this very significant ceremony for these two young women as this entrance into adulthood. But again, the pearls kind of take on a greater significance as the book goes on, which I found really fun.
They pop up time and again. This is the kind of book where there really isn't a spoiler because we all know what happens in the end to the family. But these
Yes.
pearls, you alluded to that, do have a significance at the end. So that's our spoiler. Unless you want to talk about it, I'm not going to talk about it. The whole idea of jewelry seems to permeate this book. And I don't think that that was inadvertent. I think that you were trying to send us a message there. Obviously, you think of jewelry as evidence of wealth and abundance, but they became, towards the end of the book, something very important. And what was the jewelry going to hopefully achieve for the family?
Well, the jewelry, and this is in the historical record. We know that when the family was imprisoned at, so there were 3 imprisonments that the family underwent after Nicholas's abdication. First one was in Alexander Palace, just outside of St. Petersburg. The second one was in Tobolsk, which is in Siberia. And the third one was in Ekaterinburg, which is where the last Romanovs ultimately met their final end. And we know that between the move from Tobolsk to Ekaterinburg, Alexandra had her daughters sew jewels. She broke the jewels out of their casings, out of their moldings, and she had them sewn into the corsets, the girls' corsets, into the hems of jackets, into basically all of the clothing that they could in order to conceal it from the guards. And in letters, she refers to these jewels as medicine. And the idea behind that being, ultimately, when we escape, we're going to need money. We're going to need wealth on the outside, in order to kind of build our lives again. And so these jewels that had once been signifiers of wealth become in very short order a necessity for their lives. But as I point out in the book, jewels can only do so much when you're in prison. They're not food. You can't eat them. You can't, they can't do anything unless they're in the context of the outside world. But the jewels, ultimately, historically, they ended up playing a rather grisly role in the final moments of the daughters, because when they were executed, the daughters had sewn these jewels into their corsets, and the jewels actually acted as something of a bulletproof vest. So the bullets ricocheted off of the corsets, unfortunately, and led to a much more painful end, I believe, than they otherwise would have had.
I think they experienced a lot more. It was interesting. I was reading a book recently, another book, and it talked about how in Soviet Russia, early on, maybe in the 20s or 30s, they were selling these jewels, but they were selling them by the weight. So they didn't sell them like, here's a diamond tiara and it's worth, $40,000 or rubles or whatever. It was how much it weighed, and it was so much per ounce. I mean, I thought that was pretty fascinating.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah. So Marjorie Merriweather Post, who you may be aware of, bought by the ounce, I don't know what the European equivalent is, all this jewelry.
Wow.
And she would go to these shops. They were called commission shops. And she just picked up, and she used to wear them. And now there's a museum in Washington, D.C., one of her former homes, where she has them all on display. So just another interest. So that showed to me that the Soviets had no regard for this jewelry at all.
None. Well, I mean, for them, it was a symbol of the decadence of the old regime. And certainly it was a symbol of the decadence of the old regime. You look, there are pictures of the last great ball that Nicholas and Alexandra held, and it was before the events of this book. I believe it was in 1904, 1905. And the opulence of these photographs that you see, it was a costume ball. And basically all of the safety deposit boxes in St. Petersburg were emptied for the occasion. And you look at these pictures, and it's just, they're dripping in these jewels. And you look at that and you think, your people were starving.
Yes.
And this is what you do. This is the optics of that you want to portray to people. And these are the values that you are seeing, like just so completely blinkered to the suffering of his own people. Mhm.
Your book is a very structured book, I have to say, and that's sort of kind of the way I like to approach a book. But
Yeah.
before your prologue, you use the device of an epigraph, and you have Prince Charles of Denmark
Mhm.
in 1896, when Olga was just an infant, reading Olga's horoscope, saying that there will be several critical periods in her life, but that she would never live to be 30. Actually, she lived to be 23 from 1895 to 1918. Did this event really occur, or did this use this as a device?
No, this is real. This actually happened. Prince Charles of Denmark was an amateur astrologist, and he, yep, and when she was born, he did exactly this. He drew her horoscope up, and this is what he came up with. And when I came across that detail in my research, I just thought it was so haunting, given
Yes.
what happened to her in the end, and the fact that this horoscope was in fact quite accurate. And horoscope, prophecy, myth, these are all themes that I really enjoyed kind of threading into this narrative, because the last Romanovs are so tied up in the myths that surround them, right? Like, Rasputin's prophecy and, about the end of his life, and, the mysticism that this family, Alexander in particular, believed in. It all kind of coalesced in this way in the book, to kind of shroud the family in further mystery than I think they otherwise would have had. And again, breaking them out from the symbolism and the myths, to look at them as individuals was really important.
Well, did Alexandra hear this prophecy? Because she probably went go bananas. I mean, she believed in this sort of thing.
No,
Yeah.
I truly don't know whether she ever heard the prophecy. I would think she would, because it was reported in newspapers.
Okay. She probably
But I mean, think about how unsettling that would be as a mother to hear that. If if that's something that you believe in, and Alexander certainly did.
Oh, yes. Well, she probably would have protected her and put her in a closet or something, But
Which, I
anyway,
mean, she kind of did with all of her children.
she did.
Mhm.
Going back to the structure of your book, you have a prologue, you have a list of characters, you have 39 chapters, you have an epilogue, you have an author's note, you have a glossary, you have a bibliography, and you have a reader's guide.
Yeah.
And they were all very helpful, but the most helpful to me was your author's note and the glossary, because I kept going back to that glossary. Somehow all these Russian names started sounding the same after a while, and I wanted to thank you for them. They were very helpful.
Well, I mean, here's the trouble, though. All of the names are the same in the research. It's like there were so many Nikolais and Olgas in the book. I ended up having to change one of the Olgas to an Anya just to differentiate her, because I was like, I can't have a third Olga in the book. I just can't. But
Well, Aunt Olga is a very interesting character, so I'm glad you kept her name. In the
yes.
prologue, which it opens your book, it's very dramatic. And we hear Alexei, the younger brother, the only male, the heir, screaming in pain. Now, was this regarded as a good thing or a bad thing that he's screaming?
Well, I mean, certainly it was regarded as a terrible thing that this child is in so much pain, but to Olga's mind in this chapter, and she's young here, she's, I think, only about 12 years old in this early chapter. To Olga, the screaming is a good thing because it signifies that her brother is still alive. So Alexei had hemophilia, and it was an incredibly painful, incurable condition. And the family kind of lived with this knowledge that Alexei had hemophilia, and as the only heir, this was devastating not only on a personal level but on a political level, because if he died, there was kind of no clear line of succession after him. So for Olga, listening to her brother and knowing that he's in pain, at the very least, that means he's still alive, which is, such a heartbreaking thing to think of, a 12-year-old girl having to parse through not only the devastation of potentially losing her little brother, but also having to think of the dynastic implications of that, the political implications of what that would mean.
I think you educated us in the author's note that in Russia, after Catherine the Great, women could not succeed. Now, meanwhile, we had Queen
Mhm.
Victoria, was I think the great-grandmother or
Yes,
great-granddaughter
great-grandmother.
to Alda. We have Queen Victoria, of other queens running empires or large countries. So why did Russia, if you know, change and say, okay, no women can succeed?
We have Catherine the Great's son to thank for that, actually. Her son, Paul, hated her so much that he blamed her. He felt that Catherine had her husband, Paul's father, murdered, and he never forgave her for that. There's evidence that shows that he might have been right in that Catherine had her husband assassinated. But regardless, it turned him against his mother so violently that he passed a decree that said women can never succeed to the throne ever again. And it was tied up so tightly in law and enshrined so completely in law that when we reach the turn of the century and we reach Nicholas and Alexandra, this was a real concern for them, a real problem, because they had these 4 healthy young daughters and a sickly son, and there was no mechanism in place for them to include, say, Olga into the line of succession, which would have, I think, eased at least the dynastic implications of Alexei's death.
And maybe she would have turned out to be better ruler than her dad. Because we see her, and we're going to talk about it in a few minutes, her maturing through this book. It is in the prologue that we first meet Rasputin. And you did a description of him, which I just have to read because we have so many images of this gentleman. I'll use that in quotation marks. And then the contrast with the opulent surroundings that we see him in. He was wearing a rough spun tunic, bagged trousers, wooden cross around his neck, unkempt hair, ragged beard, mud-caked boots, but his eyes were what made him distinctive. They glittered green and restless beneath his heavy grow. If that isn't the most scary guy, why would people even allow him in a house, let alone a palace? It's incredible to me. Where did you find this description, or were you just reading different sources and you came up with this, or is this the way he was really described?
This is how he was really described. Like I read through a lot of sources, but also we have pictures of Rasputin. We know what he looked like. We know what he wore, and he did have this incredibly menacing appearance, this wild appearance, which actually he would play up for. He kind of play up in the palace. There are accounts of him coming into the palace, stopping in front of a mirror and actually messing his hair up so that he would look even more unkempt when he went in. And this was very much by design because, Nicholas and Alexandra saw him as representative of the Russian people. They saw him as, as this holy man who spoke on behalf of the, of the peasantry. And so they kind of liked the fact that he looked a little scary, quite frankly. But to everybody else who knew him, he wasn't a good guy. He really wasn't. He was, he was a drunk. He would take advantage of young women. He was really quite out of control. But he could hold it together when it came to Nicholas and Alexandra.
Well, one aspect of him that you brought out that I just didn't know about or forgot was that he spoke very candidly to Alexandra, to Alexei. I didn't see too much interaction with Nicholas, but he was able to get away with that.
He certainly was.
Yeah, and he said to Alexei, "You cannot rule if you don't see the suffering of your people." Well, that message apparently gets lost, but why would they tolerate this? I mean, they are deities after all, and people shouldn't speak to them like that.
Yeah, but Rasputin, because they saw him as the kind of as this representative of the people, he kind of was able to get away with a lot, and he certainly was able to get away with speaking in let's say rather homespun terms to Nicholas and Alexandra. But I mean, one thing that I found really interesting when I was looking into him is, he's seen as this villain, and, rightly so in a lot of respects. But when he was giving advice to Nicholas and Alexander, historically, the advice really wasn't all that different from what you would expect to hear from a priest. It was take care of the children, take care of the poor in your community, make sure that you ease the suffering of people, make sure that you turn your swords into plowshares. That was really what his message was to Nicholas and Alexandra. And, but then he had this outside appearance. He had this kind of double life. So he'd be giving these messages to Nicholas and Alexander and then going outside and being a complete drunken mess in St. Petersburg and, sexually assaulting women. And this is what everybody else saw. And Nicholas and Alexander didn't see that at all. They just saw this, a coarse priest, really.
I don't think people were telling them. Now,
No.
Many of our audience may know what the hold was that Rasputin had over Alexandra, but perhaps you could just capsulize that for us so we don't make too many assumptions here. Why did they tolerate this person in their lives?
So Nicholas and Alexandra had this long-standing fascination with mysticism, as I mentioned, and they had this son who had hemophilia, which at the time was incurable. It actually is still incurable today. And so they would see Alexei in pain and they would bring in the world's leading doctors and nobody could do anything for him. They had other mystics in and out of the palace in order to help Alexander conceive. So this fascination with mysticism was a long-standing thing. But when Rasputin comes into the picture, Alexei is born, he's got hemophilia, and all the world's best doctors are unable to do anything for him to help ease his suffering. So Rasputin comes along and something about him, managed to heal Alexei, or at least it appeared that he healed Alexei. And that really was the hold that he had over the imperial couple. They would see their son in pain, Rasputin would show up, and their son would recover. He'd recover from these bleeding illnesses, from these bleeding attacks. And, even now there's really kind of no consensus on what Rasputin actually did to stop Alexei from having these attacks. There are a couple of theories, one of which is Rasputin told the royal couple to stop the doctors from giving him aspirin. Aspirin was a miracle drug at the time. It was given for everything. Aspirin is a blood thinner. Yes, and so for someone who's got hemophilia, their blood isn't clotting, aspirin's going to make it worse. So Rasputin told them to not poke and prod the child. Those were his words. Don't poke and prod him. Don't intervene. Just let him sit there. So that was one of the theories. The other one was, think about it. His mother is having hysterics at the end of the bed. He's in pain. Doctors are flitting in and out of the room. There are people praying for him in the room. There's just chaos all around him. Rasputin comes in and says, everybody calm down. He's going to be fine. And what does that do? His mother believes it, calms her down. Temperature of the room kind of falls a little bit and his heart rate would have gone down, which again would have probably helped with clotting his blood, calming him, right? And then and there's one more theory. The third one is that he would kind of show up at the very peak of the crisis. He'd come in at the 11th hour, and at that point Alexei's blood was already probably starting to clot. So he walks in, he says a prayer, and Alexei suddenly starts to feel better. Maybe he was just that he had really good timing. But all these things combined, there was more than one occasion where Rasputin seemed to have healed Alexei. And for any parent, regardless of whether your child's the future emperor of anything, if someone's going to come in and remove your child's pain, would you not give them anything in order for them to do that?
Right. I thought it might have something to do, this is pure speculation, with his eyes, this green color. And, maybe the child would fixate on the eyes, and that'd be part of this calming influence, I guess. But that's just totally, I'm sure there's no basis.
That's definitely one of the theories as well. He had these arresting eyes. and he was known to be a good, hypnotist. So yeah,
Could have been.
could be an
Well,
element there.
as I mentioned before, you have 39 chapters in this book. Now, it's not a 1,000-page book. I don't want anyone to think that it's that lengthy, but you alternate in time periods and places. So you go back and forth, back and forth. Some readers don't like that. Some object to that. What was your purpose in doing that for this book?
Well, my purpose in doing that, I really wanted to show a contrast. So there are a couple of reasons. The first was that I really wanted to show a contrast between Olga's life before and after the revolution. Olga endured 3 imprisonments, as I mentioned earlier: Alexander Palace, Tobolsk, and Ekaterinburg. And I wanted to kind of use those 3 imprisonments as structural kind of posts going through the book, and then use that as a way to kind of like harken back and look at elements of her life prior to the downfall, the revolution. The other reason is really quite simple. The last few years of Olga's life were hell. They were awful. They were incredibly depressing. And I didn't want to have a book where the second half of the book was just misery upon misery upon misery, right? I needed to have elements of levity in there, and I needed to have elements of compassion and heart. So there was certainly that aspect as well. And then I think that the kind of the structure in my mind, one of the ways that I really kind of felt that it worked was it gave kind of concrete goalposts for looking at Olga's development as she grows up, and as she kind of comes to the realization that maybe her father has not done a good job of ruling Russia, and kind of having those touch points.
Well, I think we see a progression of the relationship between the guards and the family. And to me, that represented what was going on in Russia as well. And so doing that juxtaposition of the time periods didn't bother me. I was like, okay, I'm getting this. I understand that.
I'm glad.
But Siberia is not a place to be. But what accounted for that change in the relationship? I mean, first they were captive in a palace, and then they go to Siberia, and that's not quite so great. And then they go to a really awful place. So is there something going on now in the Russian political world that they're using these folks to say, oh, we have control over this, we're changing? Or did the populace of Russia even know what happened to Nicholas and his family?
The general population did not know. It wasn't until the 1920s that the Bolsheviks actually admitted that they'd murdered Nicholas, not the family. The family, they had never really concretely admitted what they'd done to the family. And they did that because they knew that would potentially lead to outrage. The murder of young people. Alexei in particular was, I believe he was 13 years old when he died. And that would have just led to an outrage that they wouldn't have been able to control. But also, the conditions of their imprisonment were very much tied to the power structure and the power struggles that occurred in those days after the abdication. The first people to take control after Nicholas's abdication was the Duma, the State Duma, which was a more democratically, it was a much more democratic system where, there are party representatives from different parties across the political spectrum. And as the story progresses and as the years progress, the Bolsheviks gain power and gain power and gain power. And as the Bolsheviks gain power, the conditions under which the family was kept got worse and worse and worse.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think we should spend a little time now on Olga the person, because she is a central character to your book. She is the great-granddaughter of Queen Victoria. She is the oldest of 4 sisters. And she's the one that's the more mature. She's obviously older. She's starting to have life experiences. How did you bring her voice out? I mean, you have these conversations where she's speaking to a variety of different people about many different topics, and it seems so genuine, so real. How were you able to accomplish that?
Well, one of the ways, I was incredibly lucky to find her diaries translated into English. So I was able to get Olga's voice directly from the diaries, which was incredibly helpful in kind of developing that sense of her. We also have memoirs of retainers and, people who were very close to her family, her tutors, for example, Isa Buxbaden and Anna Vyrubova, who is, Anna Vyrubova is a sort of a secondary character in the book. So we have these accounts of who she was in life. And one of the things that every account tells us about her is that she was incredibly compassionate, and she cared about people. She cared about, the suffering of people. And so that was something that I really wanted to bring forward, particularly as she's looking at people through the lens of her father's rule, and realizing that her father's rule is not equitable and it's not good for everybody. I really wanted to bring that forward. And the other thing that really intrigued me about her, because she and her sisters were so sheltered, in my mind, I'd known about the family for a long time. I'd known the stories that, I'd watched Anastasia. And in all of the kind of retellings, it was Olga and her sisters are just there. And in my mind, I'd assumed that they were very sheltered, which in a sense they absolutely were. And Olga, throughout the course of this book, she kind of rebels against this, the fact that her parents kept her very sheltered and cloistered. But I didn't really realize that she was politically aware until I read in a number of the sources that Olga, upon Rasputin's assassination, Olga's response is, I understand why it had to happen.
Yes.
I didn't agree with the methods. I don't agree with how they did it, but I understand why it had to happen. And so that indicated to me that here's this young woman who was much more politically aware than I had given her credit for. She understood what was going on in Russia. She understood the strains of the people in a way that I think her parents never truly did. And so that to me was really interesting. And then, she's in her 20s. She has these romances. She talks about them in her diaries. She talks about skinny dipping in Finland. And all of this stuff kind of coalesced in my mind. It's like, oh, here's this young, incredibly vibrant person who probably could have done a lot for either Russia or another country if she'd been given the opportunity. And so I wanted to kind of bring that forward.
Well, I think that you recite a conversation that she had with her mother sort of towards the end of the book. And we don't know if that conversation actually happened, but do you think at some point, I'd like to read that quote, she would have had the ability to say this to her mother? She said, you say, Olga told her mother that the old ways are dying out and that she will not spend her life as a relic of a bygone era. To which her mother replied that God will provide. Trust in him to provide you with the husband you need to help our country move forward. And I just wondered, do you think she ever had the wherewithal to say that to her mother?
I certainly hope so.
Yeah, I do too, but
I certainly hope so. And Olga, Olga's marital prospects were one of the biggest things that we know about her. Every single source talks about her marital prospects because she was seen as, as a bit of a pawn, right? As a political pawn. She could have married into some other royal family. But Olga, and this is true, and this is one of the reasons that I loved her so much, is she extracted a promise from her parents. And bear in mind, this is the turn of the century, and this is not something that a lot of women could do. She extracted a promise from her parents to say she was not going to be used as a political pawn. She would be allowed to marry for love. And to Nicholas and Alexander's credit, they gave her the opportunity to kind of search that out. And that to me just was such a, that's one of the reasons why I think that conversation could have happened. Okay. Because she had that sense of self-actualization and that ability to stand on her own 2 feet and extract a promise from her parents that she was going to be able to shape the life that she wanted and marry, if she found the right man, marry the right man that she wanted to marry.
Well, you alluded to 2 romantic involvements that she had, and we probably are running out of time, so we won't get into those, but those were interesting relationships that she did have. And I think that brought a new aspect to her personality. Also working as a Red Cross nurse. Although you do point out that she worked in a better hospital for officers than the one that was for the enlisted soldiers. But I think it might be time, I'm looking at my watch here, to make sure that if our audience has questions, Amanda, that we ask them now, and then if not, I can continue on. I have lots more questions.
Yes, of course. At the moment, there aren't any questions. We certainly encourage anyone joining us to send any questions or comments through the Q&A in the chat at the bottom.
Well, I'll just continue going. And Amanda, if somebody pops up with a question, just shut me down and we'll answer that.
Sure
of course.
thing. You got it, Mary.
Yeah. There was an interesting character, and I'd never heard about this. So fascinating to me, a guy named Jim Hercules.
Jim Hercules, yes.
And maybe you could tell our audience about this phenomenon personified in Jim Hercules. I don't know if he's an actual person or if that was a name that you gave him, but
no, he was real. He was real. Yeah, so he was an American retainer in the court of Nicholas II. He was a Black man. We believe he was from Tennessee, but we're not entirely sure historically whether he was from Tennessee or elsewhere. But we know that he spent time as a boxer in New York, and he ended up, in order to basically to escape the Jim Crow South and to escape prejudice in the United States, he went to the court of Nicholas II, and he gained a position. It was called the position was called an ARAP, ARAP. And basically it was a footman to Nicholas II, where a footman and kind of sort of a bodyguard. So if Jim Hercules was walking down the hall, you would know that Nicholas would be following in short order. And, in a lot of the sources, we kind of learned that he had a good relationship with the family. He would travel back home, he'd visit his parents, he'd visit his mother, and he'd bring back homemade jam for the children from his mother. And yeah, so he was a character that I really wanted to include in the book because, just what an interesting individual. And I really hope that somebody someday writes the story of Jim Hercules, because just such an interesting man.
The name alone.
I know, yeah.
Is there a question there, Amanda? Am I seeing that or
yes,
not?
Debbie asked, well, she said, I have not finished the book, but what do you think about the theories of Anastasia's survival?
Hi, Debbie. I hate to say it, but the theories of Anastasia's survival have been thoroughly historically debunked. Unfortunately, the family's remains, and the reason why there's been a question about it for so long is, as I said, the Bolsheviks never admitted to murdering the family, and Nicholas's mother, the Dowager Empress, actually through to the end of her life believed that her grandchildren had survived, which is so heartbreaking. And that's why these pretenders were able to come forward. The reason that they chose to impersonate Anastasia was because, as the youngest daughter, her features hadn't fully formed. And so, if there were some, physical discrepancies, the pretenders could kind of say, well, I matured, my cheekbones look different for that reason. But they found the family in two separate mine shafts. What ended up happening, the family was murdered and their bodies were separated. They were thrown down two separate mine shafts. The first one was discovered, I believe, in the 1990s, and it contained five of the 7 family members. But two of the family members were not found. They were found at a later date, which again kind of leads to these theories about survival. But unfortunately, all the family members have been found, and unfortunately, they were all murdered on that day, which is just so heartbreaking. Because Anastasia was such a fire plug. She was such an interesting girl. I talk in the book about how she tried to breed worms. She was trying to breed a race of, like, she was trying to breed these super worms that could unlock doors. And this was like one of her things. And she was called the imp by her family because she had this very, very outsized sense of humor. And there are photos of her in 1911 standing on the back of a chair with a box brownie camera, taking a photo into a mirror, which is considered kind of one of the first selfies. So she's this incredibly interesting young woman, and it's such a tragedy that she lost her life so young.
Well, there's always a question that audiences ask, and why did you write the book? Now, we've talked about it for almost an hour. You're very excited about the subject matter, but there are a lot of books that one can write. So why this particular one and this particular woman, Olga?
I've always been interested by the Romanovs, but for me, Olga, knowing that she was this politically aware individual, knowing that she was a nurse during the First World War, that she had these romances. Here's a young woman that we always see as, a face underneath a crown. And she was so much more than that. And so, you mentioned in the intro, I like to tell the stories of women who were kind of caught between the cracks of history. And here's this young woman she's got kind of a ringside seat to this monumental event, this monumental political upheaval at the turn of the 20th century, not only the Russian Revolution, but the First World War. And I thought, what an interesting perspective she could bring to these stories and to these events that we know so well, bring that different perspective.
Well, to your credit, you don't act as an apologist for the family,
No.
Nicholas, Alexandra. I think that you have a focus, an angle here that others may not have thought about. And Nicholas was such a bad leader. I mean, there's no other way to put it. The mother was kind of bonkers, but they cared about their family. They cared about their children. And he, as we see in the book towards the end, worked so hard to keep them together. And all he achieved was that they were killed together. I mean,
yeah, and it is so heartbreaking on that personal level. When I write a book, particularly when I'm writing a book about historical figures, it's not my job to make heroes and villains. And it's not my job to view history in stark black and white terms. I certainly have my opinions on it all. But for me, I think that there's a responsibility that historical fiction authors have to historical subjects, to be as fair as we can and unbiased as we can in our portrayal of them. There's always going to be those personal biases that kind of creep in. But, in Nicholas's case, I certainly don't see him as a hero. And I would not consider myself an apologist for the Romanovs. But, I wanted to include this element of him as a father. And looking at him from Olga's perspective, she's this young woman, she's a daughter who is realizing that her parents are not perfect, that her parents have actually made some monumental, devastating errors in how they've gone about their lives and their work. But she's also a daughter who loves her parents. And that to me was so important to strike that balance between her coming to this realization that her parents are not perfect, but still loving them. That was really important to me.
and one final question, if I may, I don't see any more from the audience, is we always want to know what you're working on now. Is there a new book that's coming out? If so, if you could tell us a little bit about it, when you think it might hit the shelves, because I'm sure people will be looking for it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so my book now that I'm working on, it's Art, Theft, and Forgery in Occupied France during the Second World War. Yes. So it takes place in a museum called the Jeu du Paume Museum, where the Nazis basically took all of the art that they looted from Jewish families. And it's a story that takes place within that museum. So I'm not in Toronto at the moment. I'm at my family cottage up in the Great Lakes on a bit of a writing retreat for a couple of weeks to hammer out as many chapters as I can before my deadline.
So sometime in 2023, perhaps?
Yep, the hope is summer 2023.
And do we have a working title, or are we just supposed to look for your name and hope we can find the book?
Well, so this is the trouble. My working titles always get changed.
Oh,
I've never had a book go to print with the working title, but the working title right now is Avant-Garde. So that's what we're calling it now, but I guarantee you it will come to my publisher and they'll be like, we hate the title. We're going to change it.
Well, this has been a delightful conversation. I think we've successfully combined a little history lesson with some insights into this very tragic family. And we really appreciate it. And we hope that when your next book comes out, you can join us again with our friends at the Westerly Library.
I would love that. It's been such a wonderful chat, Mary. Thank you so much. And thanks to all the participants who joined. It's been such a pleasure. I look forward to talking to you again.
Well,
Thank you
very
so
much.
much, Bryn. Thank you
Oh.
to Mary as well. We just
Thanks,
really
Amanda.
appreciate you taking the time, truly. This was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Good
Bye.
time.
Take
Bye,
care,
Amanda.
everybody.
everyone. Good night.
Good night.